The European Union is a significant global economy which shares the world's gross domestic product in PPS, being similar to that of China and the United States, and more than twice that of India, according to 2017 figures. And the construction industry is a very important part of the EU economy. The sector provides 25 million direct jobs and contributes to about 9.6% of the EU's GDP. These two make construction in economic terms the second most important of the 14 identified ecosystems, with retail being the only ecosystem with higher employment. That's 30 million people compared to 25 million in construction, and value added of 11.5%. Construction activity in Europe also has a large environmental footprint. Construction accounts for about 50% of all extracted material. It is responsible for over 35% of the EU's total waste generation. Greenhouse gas emissions from material extraction, manufacturing of construction products, as well as construction and renovation of buildings are estimated at 5 to 12% of the total national greenhouse gas emissions. Greater material efficiency could save 80% of those emissions. Many roadmaps developed worldwide for decarbonising the construction sector. For these roadmaps to be effective, we need leadership from industry, governments and other stakeholders. The European Union aims to be carbon neutral by 2050, economy with net zero greenhouse gas emissions. This objective is at the heart of the European Green Deal and in line with the EU's commitment to global climate action under the Paris Agreement. EU member states are required to develop national long-term strategies on how they plan to achieve the greenhouse gas emission reductions needed to meet the commitments under the Paris Agreement and the EU objectives. The European Commission has adopted a set of proposals to make the EU's climate, energy, transport and taxation policies fit for reducing greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. A key part of this is to decouple economic growth from greenhouse gas emissions. Not only does it focus on buildings and climate, but also on society and economy. The building sector needs to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by 60% in 2030 compared to the 2015 levels. It's important to move from words to action. The Commission is developing a 2050 roadmap to reduce whole life cycle emissions of buildings as part of the Renovation Wave. Better quality information and data is needed to benchmark individual buildings' whole life cycle emissions, as well as emissions of the construction ecosystem at national and EU levels. Several ongoing Commission studies are expected to fill some of these data gaps. As part of the revision of the Construction Products Regulation, it is expected that all construction products entering the single market will include data on the carbon footprint. This will facilitate calculations of the life cycle emissions at the level of the works. For buildings, such calculations will be carried out using tools aligned with the Levels framework, and for new buildings, there will be regulation under the Energy Performance of Building Directive's recast proposal. Several EU member states have already implemented requirements to disclose life cycle emissions, and in some cases maximum limit values also apply. For the construction ecosystem, a push to address life cycle emissions should help to stimulate innovation in products, processes, design and construction practices and tools. Construction has a major role to play in the fight against climate change, not only by mitigating emissions, but also by contributing to climate adaptation. There's a holistic approach needed. Success will depend on joined-up thinking, strict implementation and contributions from every actor in the value chain. We're going to look at the EU and member states' general approach on whole life cycle carbon in buildings. It's an incremental approach. The first step requires assessment and reporting, where the second step sets targets and limits values. Let's go through each of these steps one by one. So the first step is to require assessment and reporting of whole life cycle carbon emissions in each member state. There's a number of directives and regulations that are already starting to set this in place. For example, sustainable finance taxonomy requires that large, so buildings over or developments over 5,000 square meters in terms of new construction are required to disclose whole life cycle carbon as of January 2022. The Energy Performance of Building Directive recast is expected for whole life cycle carbon disclosure requirements for 2027 onwards, again for larger buildings and for all buildings from 2030 onwards. And there's construction product regulations review. There's information requirements on the product's environmental footprint. There's already tools in place and standards in place across Europe to help us there. So already in policy initiatives are, for example, the Levels, which is a European framework for sustainable buildings and is the basis on which to bring whole life cycle carbon into building policy. So once we have a methodology, which we have through the Levels, and which has been implemented in Ireland, for example, through the upfront CO2 and indicate projects, then we test that methodology in the national context. We spread the knowledge and build market capacity, generate data so we can start to benchmark, and then have a soft reduction in whole life cycle carbon coming later on. We can already see in the market, for example, in Ireland, many of the large house builders, for example, are undertaking whole life cycle carbon of their developments to align with the EU taxonomy to get lower finance on their developments. The next step is to set targets and limiting values. So we need to benchmark first to be able to get the business as usual in there so that we can set the targets in and what the limiting values are. There's already been developed by the EU through different roadmap reductions of whole life cycle carbon. We've quantified targets with milestones up to 2050, includes the embodied and operational carbon, and not a list of policy recommendations. Brings together experts and initiatives inspired by the frontrunners that are engaged across the EU. So based on the methodology, by the 1st of January 2027, Member States will have to produce roadmaps containing minimum values on the total whole life cycle carbon of the new buildings and set targets for new buildings from 2030. There are a number of front-running countries in Europe who have life cycle carbon requirements in place. For example, France, the Netherlands and Denmark all have whole life cycle carbon legislation with limiting values in force or agreed. Other countries require reporting obligations in force and the limit values to be proposed, such as in Sweden. And in other countries, such as in the UK and Germany, have non-legislative LCA requirements in place for certain buildings. We look at this in a bit more detail for each of the front-runner countries of Denmark, Finland, France, Netherlands and Sweden. On this graph here you see that, on this diagram here you see the different stages of the life cycle of a building from A1 all the way up to D. So A being A1 to A3 being the product, A4 being to A5 being the construction process, the B's being the use stage, C's being the deconstruction or the end of life stage, and D being the boundary systems for the recycling recovery potential at the end. So we can see there the dark blue is where it's in scope of current whole life cycle legislation is in place. So all these countries have this in place for A1 to A3, which is the product stages, and most except Denmark have it in for the construction process stage as well. Many of them have it in for the replacement as well, which is the B4 stage, as well as for the deconstruction stage as well, which is the C stages. Regulation and other policies are included in terms of the operational side, and operation of energy and operation of water. What about imports into the European Union from outside the EU? The world's first tariffs on carbon intensive imports will come into force on the 1st of October 2023 with the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism. During the initial transition phase, importers of carbon intensive goods including cement, iron and steel will only be required to report the greenhouse gas emissions embedded in their products. From the 1st of January 2026, importers will also need to buy CBAM certificates and thereby pay for the embodied emissions.